Hey there. This past August, before I went back to New Mexico, I had an awkward conversation with a former supporter and someone I considered a friend who said, with some sarcasm-laden disdain, well, so much for letting that go, in response to my going back to the desert to find remains. That was her parting shot. And so I wanted to talk about why I continue the MMIW work, even though it has not evolved at all in the way I want it to. I mean, to be honest, I am fucking tenacious. I'm like a dog after a bone sometimes. However, there are reasons for that as well. So I do this in part because I recognize myself in these women, and I recognize the rejection of these particular dead women and girls. I know intimately the integrated systems that perpetuate their disappearance and the lack of response around their disappearances. And I am bound in so many ways to this unfolding of God's work. First, I have a deep, profound tie to justice that began when I was a child. It's not an idea of justice or an ideal of justice, but it is the very essence of love in action. Second, my relationship with ancestors and the ground are inescapable. I cannot turn off the flow. I can't even meter it. And I certainly can't remove that ponderosa along my spine that contains the energies of millions of women. Oh, though I wish I could. They are me, though, and I am them as much as I am the sinew and the bones that make the rest of me like me. Third, I remember the first murder I felt in 2009. When I experienced a replay of a young girl being chased down and murdered in Fauquier County in the early 1980s, in 1985, I think. But in the moment, I only knew what I was feeling. I was behind the steering wheel and feeling a young girl's terror and the glee and trepidation and awe of two boys. And those energies were so powerful that I had to pull the car over to try to find my breath. And then it was only when I arrived at my destination and shared the experience that I was told about the murderer. I couldn't understand, and still don't really, how something so powerfully from 25 years prior could be felt by me. I didn't get energies, and echoes of energies are not bound by my watch or calendar or anyone's imagination. That's why when I was in Ajo, Arizona in October of 2017, I couldn't tell if the screams I was hearing from two women who were being murdered was from the moment or from an echo of the past. I suspect it was probably in the moment because of how the rest of my body and souls responded. But with hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of empty miles of desert in front of me and all around me, I had no idea of knowing from where or how far those cries had traveled. I only knew and know that they'd made their way to me purposefully. And the fourth reason I continue is because I believe. I believe that even though this hasn't gone the way I have wanted it to, I believe because others have responded in the most dramatic of ways. I've been shot at in Arizona. I've been followed in Safeway in Wichita, Kansas. I've been swatted in Montrose, Colorado. I've been targeted in Alexandria, Virginia. I've watched a journalist I trusted tell someone in the Mexican army about what I'd found. And I've been warned a year and a half ago by federal law enforcement while asking, "Do you have ACE rewards?" that danger had found me here in Telluride, Colorado as well. And I've had enough encounters with civilians who don't know me insist that wherever I am, I need to get the fuck out to not believe. I know that when I make certain phone calls or whoopsies happen to stumble upon certain agencies' operations in the middle of Nowheresville, the immediate response for people is to call DARPA to see if I can possibly know what I know, without the courage to actually ask me face to face, which still astounds me because everybody's got my telephone numbers and knows exactly where I live. And that doesn't even count all of the encounters between Spirit and Native cops that tell me over and over again that I'm onto something bigger than I can see right now. And what I can see right now is huge. So in 8 years, after 8 years, I just don't give up. I wrote in November of 17 this: I believe in the heart of a sister. I believe in the touch of the ancestors. I believe the presence of the beloveds and elephant trunks kissing my face. I believe because a giraffe isn't just a giraffe, she's called April and speaks herself into my existence. I believe because the heart knows what it knows. I believe because I trust the faith of those that guide and those who step into the face of the threat with me and remind me that between each breath, I become that which has been prayed for, the called and the response. Lastly, I keep it this because it's time somebody actually did. This is old shit. This is old shit repeating like new shit, and it all still stinks like shit. By most historians' estimates, because people study this actually, in the Americas alone, between 1492 and 1900, there were between 2.5 million and 5 million indigenous slaves. That's on the continent. Well, several of them. These numbers do not include those indigenous peoples who were shipped to Europe from the continent. What is known is that this particular phenomena began by Indians offering their own slaves to Europeans in exchange for goods like food, weapons, metalwork, and more. Andres Resendez, someone who I study and quote a lot, has shared what started as European-controlled enterprise gradually passed into the hands of the Native Americans. Sorry about that. As Indians acquired horses and weapons of their own, they became independent slave providers. In the Southwest, the Comanches and Utes became regional suppliers of slaves to other Indians, as well as to the Spaniards, to Mexicans, and Americans. The Apache, who early on had been the greatest victims of enslavement, transformed themselves into successful slavers. And things were only slightly different in the eastern part of the new country. I'm quoting Resendez again. Between the period of 1670 and 1720, Carolinians exported more Indians out of Charleston, South Carolina, than they imported Africans into it. Think about that for a hot second. As that traffic developed, the colonists increasingly procured their indigenous captives from the West Coast Indians, what he described as an extraordinarily expansive, militaristic slaving society. Those West Coast Indians and other tribes roamed from Virginia south into Florida, taking captives to sell to other Indians and to white Carolinians. When I began all of this in 2017, I knew some of the historical context, but I wouldn't grasp the bigness or the oldness of this for months and even years. I remember driving south on Arizona 85 a few hours before hearing those two women scream, feeling similar to how I'd felt in other places where there is this like slow slog of like remembering foot travels and wagon travels and the lostness and the displacement being removed from the places and the people that mattered much, with this new layer of fear on top of that. And then I only began to realize like the length of time that the ground and others were trying to express to me. But it was just a fleeting thing that didn't become really clear until I started researching the book in 2020 that is now just gathering dust wherever. It's not lost on me, though, that the center of this network that I call the fuckery that stretches from Australia to South Korea has a hub in the Phoenix metro area. Phoenix may have only been a U.S. city since 1868, but the history of those who lived and moved through there predates any of our written recordings available to us. Like the maps of the borders that came into being long before modernity, they show us the routes that people took from central Mexico into Colorado, Idaho, California, Illinois, and more. Linguists trace the same kind of paths from western Mexico all along the Gulf Coast to as far east as Florida and north into the Carolinas. And artifacts from what is now south of the American border have been found in far north Canada. Before we carved everything up with imaginary lines and paved highways, people moved much farther than we've been taught in school. And in doing so, they stole and traded and sold and lived much more than we've been taught as well. Those beginnings of Indian enslavement in the Southwest have direct ties to the sex trafficking in Indian country today, as well as the fuckery's hub in Phoenix. The relationships built over time by families, lawful commerce, criminal organizations of all persuasions, militaries, other traders and travelers, particularly along our more modern borders, have been evolving since long before white faces showed up on the continent. However, the Spaniards' discovery of silver and the labor necessary to mine it and then to refine it took things to a whole new level and created a mass commercialization of slave trafficking that survived its illegality, because it was then, and it's morphed into its current state. The illegality that made it difficult for Spanish slavers to work created an avenue for Indian traffickers to fill that void that continues today, except now we're not trading slaves for mines, we're doing it for sex. And there's a story I don't want to, but I'm going to share here. In 1694, barely 2 years after the Spanish had retaken control of the province, a group of Navajos arrived in a market in New Mexico with the intention of selling Pawnee children. The Spanish authorities initially refused to acquire the young captives because Indian slavery was illegal by Spanish royal decree. But the traffickers, in response, proceeded to behead the captive children within the Spanish colonists' sight. That strategy prompted New Mexican officials, who were Spaniards at the time, to reconsider the ban against ransoming Indian captives in effect. The Navajo, Ute, Comanche, and Apache forced New Mexican authorities to break the law and accept the captives they were being provided so they would not be murdered in front of them. So I have quoted again from Andres Resendez, who actually added this last little bit. By the middle of the 18th century, these commercial and diplomatic relations had become normalized. Archives like government treaties and mission and military communications related how the expansion for more human goods refashioned the livelihoods and neighborhoods of desert, plains, and plateau tribes. As horse-heavy Comanches and Utes repeatedly raided communities, people moved to escape. And when family was captured, those who were left often moved to join yet other bands and tribes. Those who were captured, if they weren't sold, were married into or enslaved for life within other indigenous communities. Resendez says that the Comanches took many of their captives to New Mexico, where in the absence of money and silver, women and children constituted a versatile medium of exchange accepted by Spaniards, Frenchmen, Englishmen, Pueblans, and many other Indian groups in the region. The flow of the Indian slave trade then saw Apaches sold by Comanches to French colonists in Quebec, to the extent that the Apache came to comprise as many as 1/4 of all Indian slaves of known origin in what they called the New France. And then the opening up of California and the expansion of Europeans across the West only expanded the practice yet again, with new traffickers, new routes, and new victims. Now, just like then, multi-generational rivalries, intertribal animosities, military history, other lost ties to ancients and to lands and to resources still fuel that trade that expanded yet again when Indian gaming opened up. Stolen and sold for labor and to increase tribal populations, Indian women and children of the past were the most taken in the past. And their value, according to records, was double that of adult males. Now, I don't know how much a young woman's value is determined by traffickers these days. I'm going to assume it's a hell of a lot more than the $150 to $200 per person from the 1850s. I do know that the ROI, the return on investment, now exceeds that anyone imagined back then. With the advent of modern technologies, the ease of intra and intercontinental travel, and the myriad of ways and number of times a young person's sexuality can be exploited, the amount of money brought in by thousands of women and girls who were disappeared and then abused and then murdered is staggering. And in my opinion, the trafficking of women and children these days, especially for the labor of sexual exploitation, is normalized and it's institutionalized. It's so normal to me that when somebody sees something, they don't say something, except the odd bird like yours truly. It's so normal that the political infrastructure of bringing new Indian casinos into being, long before construction has even begun, includes plans for how to incorporate the sale of sex by slaves in new communities with new victims, new routes. Well, not so much new. We've got the roads paved now. And the not so new traffickers, though. Human trafficking in Indian country is, in many parts of the continent, traditional. Perhaps if I talk about it just long enough and just loud enough, people will feel supported enough to say something when they do see something. Maybe they will say something to their tribal council or to casino management or to white legislators. Maybe they'll say something to victims, to those who pimp and pander. Maybe they'll say yet more to others to prevent more victimization. Maybe they'll ask questions and demand accountability and openly challenge practices and people that allow it to flourish and to rip communities apart. To me, I keep going because it's time that tradition was eradicated. However, compounding all of this is this larger conversation about how we as a collective or collectives around the globe value or choose not to value girls and women and what's between their legs and their ears, especially those in marginalized communities that exist outside of our vision or our vision of what is right and proper. However, that's a discussion for a much different time. So my first encounter with the disappeared was in like the first or second grade, where in the safety of a classroom, like the lights went down and this 1970s like Stranger Danger movie went up. The only thing I remember about it now, very clearly, is this final scene where there's this single white little kid's sneaker floating down this slow moving shallow stream, indicating to us impressionable youngsters that the girl in the movie who had talked to the stranger had indeed met danger. And I'm pretty sure it occurred to all of us in the moment that there was a distinct resemblance between this creek in the movie and the creek behind Forest Heights Elementary. That didn't stop many of us from actually skipping the creek to get to Eastover Shopping Center, for any number of reasons. And of course, when you're a kid that young, you don't know when this is going to or how this is going to affect you. But these years in between, like the disappeared were just like characters in like these crime novels, these detective stories that I devoured. I still do. And in these stories, my favorite grizzled curmudgeonly cop who's always irritated by the younger generation and modern technology that he avoids, he determinedly plows through his hangovers and the bureaucracies to find the missing woman or the bad guy that had made the woman missing. However, when I was in college, when I went back the second time, I began researching los desaparecidos for a college course. And in that, I was disabused of all notions of fiction and clear delineations between the good guys and the bad guys. And I was staggered by the realities of the scale of mechanized systems for disappearing people. Like, no imagination was needed, or to me was even possible to conjure the enormity of what, say, Chile's Augusto Pinochet and the military junta of Argentina were able to accomplish in such a short time with the complicity of the United States government. Thanks, guys. That research paper I wrote long ago, it's been forgotten. But as I have moved past or through the past 8 years, like, the similar emotions have arisen repeatedly: anger, despair, and utter impotence, with the single question of why? Like, fuck, why? And there's this answer of greed and power. That's not enough for me. That's just not enough. I want to know what it is beyond that. What's underneath? What truly is the foundation holding this systemic and government-supported disappearances of women and girls for sexual exploitation as like a steady as she goes pattern? What is it? And I carry on this tradition like other people. I mean, with a hell of a kind of tradition in it. Most folks don't know Jaswant Kalra. They don't know that he was a human rights hero. Most will have never heard of him outside of India. But in the late 1980s, Kalra was a director of a farmers co-op bank in Punjab, when a couple of his colleagues just suddenly went missing, as we call it. It's so clean then. Anyhow, he went to go find them and discovered that the Punjab police had murdered and cremated thousands of Sikhs. At least, according to his estimations, 25,000 Sikhs. And for his findings, he was rewarded with being disappeared himself and murdered by those same police. But just before he was murdered, he visited Canada as part of the Sikh National Congress, I think it's called, where he told the world about the severity of human rights atrocities in India. And some of his supporters worried about like the increasing threats to his life and urged him to stay in Canada as a political asylee. However, Kalra responded with, "A truly wise person knows the truth and justice are greater than fear." And oddly enough, or maybe not so oddly, because there are no mistakes in how this is unfolding. The day that the Navajo cops sent me the missing persons flyer in 2017 that got me into all this, September 6th, is recognized by the global Sikh community as the day that he was disappeared and murdered. And part of me likes to think that at least part of the purpose of Durga's visitation on the night of September 6th, that was like some part of that was to weave Jaswant and I together. And like Jaswant and I, Las Abuelas de la Plaza Mayo dedicated themselves to finding those desaparecidos and those born from forced pregnancies and adoptions. Also a very familiar thread in the United States as well. Again, time for another time. Victims and relatives and human rights groups have done the same in Chile. Even more women do the work across Mexico, discovering mass grave after individual grave and dump site after dump site across the country. And the only difference between here and there is scale. There are those that will argue with me that it's just not happening here like it did there or it does there. And other than the numbers, I disagree entirely. Although we don't know what the numbers are. I will say that it occurs with as much impunity as it has in other places in the Americas. And one of the reasons that I'm becoming so much more vocal is that the Trump administration is in the early stages of disappearing people just like it's happened in the past. And this is not separate from that. It can't be. I mean, he's not ordering people thrown out of planes and helicopters yet that we're aware of. But I can see that happening again in other places, especially if the CIA's SOG and PAG end up manipulating things in Venezuela, because, yeah, we've done that in the past. And because history doesn't repeat itself. People repeat the behaviors of the people before them. Governments do the same. In addition, there's the absolute objective hypocrisy in this administration's murder of multiple civilians from another country on the high seas over 1,000 miles away to create this false show of force against the cartels, while simultaneously giving the Sinaloa cartel, perhaps now in partnership with CJNG, direct access to the most impoverished and vulnerable communities to protect his relationship with gaming, or whatever twisted reasoning he and Mr. Volt might have. That hypocrisy is astonishing to me. So beyond, where the remains are, what I know and what federal and tribal law enforcement actually, they know. FinCEN and other counter-threat finance groups know how the money laundered through Indian gaming makes its way to Al-Qaeda and to other homegrown terrorists, those in North America who, in a grand display of irony, would love Indian country and the Mexicans who fund them illicitly to not exist. Weird, no? Tribal law enforcement has repeatedly reported to the Department of Justice that it's aware of sex trafficking and drug trafficking in Indian casinos across the country. But their response is limited, in part because of jurisdictional issues, in part because of the lack of interest from federal law enforcement, and the fact that those within its ranks are also participants and beneficiaries. And who's going to police themselves? I mean, really? So this discussion doesn't even include the role of the Sinaloans in moving drugs into and through damn near every res in the U.S. So I'm speaking again publicly and repeatedly. And as I stir the shit pot, we'll see what happens and who rises to the top and what else evolves from this thing that I'm in that I won't leave, much to other people's consternation. And I'm going to leave it at that because I've been running off at the mouth. There's so much more to come. Adios.